Friday, November 10th, 2023 is the 26th day of Cheshvan, and it is the first yahrtzeit of Rav Feivel Cohen, the author of Badi Shochan. When he died, they announced that he had asked to be no hespeitim in writing or in person, and instead people should learn his svarim, particularly on his shloshim and his yahrtzeit. And then this is going to be a sort of a partial fulfillment of that request. I'm going to be talking about some rulings on things that related to Kashrus that he had said. Of course, Badi Shochan and Basa B'chav and Taruvas are filled with his rulings, and people learn from them all the time and make Kashrus decisions and rulings based on that. But that's not what this is going to be. Rather, these are going to be from personal conversations that I had with him or similar sources of things that are not, to my knowledge, in this forum. What I'm going to say doesn't necessarily reflect CRC policies or even policies of other hashkachas necessarily. It's really just to highlight some things that he had said, just to bring them out in the way that we can. Personally, my connection is my father knows him for decades, literally from before I'm born. And I myself learned by him for 3 years when he ran a choleh in Far Rockaway, and had dealings with him afterwards. The things that I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to talk about him himself, but he did have, aside from the 10 or so rulings I'm going to mention from him when I speak now, his lesser known effects on Kashrus are, he had a role in my originally becoming involved in hashkacha and my working originally for the OU at that time. Later, he discouraged me from printing a certain sefer, a Kashrus related sefer that even to this day has not been printed, but he discouraged me from printing that. He discouraged me, I wrote an article about worms and fish, a specific one of my articles about it. He didn't think that was a good idea, and I did not print because of that. And there was a time when a specific job in Kashrus became available or was offered to me, and he did not think that was a good idea. And again, I did do that. So in these different ways, so these are very private ways that no one else would know about, and probably many other ways, he played a role in hashkacha. So now let's go into some of the rulings that he gave. That again, we're going to focus on rulings that he gave that either to me directly, or similar circumstances like that, or that are particular that are not in this far. And the first like this. The first two are going to have to do with the question about Copepods in New York City water. These are these tiny little bugs that are in the water, excuse me, in New York City water. And the first thing was like this. When you see these little Copepods, when you see them, they look like little pieces of, like pieces of dandruff. And if you look at them by yourself, most people would never recognize that those things are bugs. Under a magnification of about 10 times, then you could start to see that there's something over here. And the question is, if you can see a bug, but you can't recognize it, you just see it without magnification, you can just see it, but you can't recognize it, is that considered to be nearly nine? Is that considered visible or not? And so on this one, excuse me, Rav Feivel wasn't giving his own ruling, but he asked Rabbi Yashav this question, and Rabbi Yashav told him that such bugs are considered nearly nine, and therefore they're asur. So that was the first step, regarding the Copepods, was to consider those bugs to be nearly nine. Now, the truth is, with time, there were people who said they could recognize even with that magnification, but that's not what I'm focusing on. Focusing on this idea that if you could see something, but you can't recognize that it's a bug, he considered that to be that's considered visible enough to be considered nearly nine. Now, a little more complicated part of the shiloh was like this. The Gemara says that if a bug is spawned, and depending on where the bug is born, will depend on whether a bug might be mutter or asur. A water bug might be mutter or asur depending on where it was born, if it stayed in that original habitat. So the Gemara is like this: if it was born in yam and nachalim, that means lakes or rivers, then it's for sure asur. If it was born in a kli, in a container, meaning a container filled with water, what we call kalim, then they're mutter until they crawl out of the water. And the same thing applies if it's in a bar, means it's a hole in the ground that has water collected inside of it. And then if it's charitzim neitzim, those are like canals, that has the status of water that's in yamun chalam. Okay, now, so these two last two cases, boiras and charitzim neitzim, are the ones that are a little bit more questionable. And the Gemara is like this: a bar is similar to kalim because the water in a bar, in a ditch, it just stays still. It's a tzurim. It just stays. It doesn't move at all. But the water in charitzim neitzim is more like yam and chalam. It's more like a river or a lake because the water's in motion. Okay, so so here we have is if the water's in motion and it's coming from a spring, yam and chalam, then it's for sure aser. If it's in a kli, it's for sure mutter. Boiras are treated like kalim, and charitzim itzim canals are treated, like yam and chalam. Charitzim itzim are treated like yam and chalam, and the things there are also in them. So now, the way he described it, he broke up the water delivery system in New York into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different stages of the river. Okay, first there are rivers in the Catskills and other places. That's the first step. Those feed into these huge reservoirs. That's the second step. The reservoirs feed into aqueducts, very large aqueducts. That's the third step. To a holding pen in Kensico. That's the fourth step. Okay, then from Kensico it goes through pipes. That's the fifth step into a reservoir in a place called Hillside, which is just north of Westchester County. That's the sixth step, and the last is it goes from Hillside into water mains that go to the rest of New York City, to the houses, etc. So now but by the time that the bugs come, the Copepods make their way to people's homes, they're already been killed. They're not going to walk in people's homes. At that point, once they leave the water, they're not going anyplace. So the rivers and the reservoirs, that means the first one was the rivers and the Catskills, and the reservoirs, that was the second and the fourth. So there's big reservoirs up in the Catskills, and the fourth is the Kensico holding pen, and the fourth is the Hillside Reservoir. All of those are obvious to him. Were obvious that those are yam and chalam. Those are huge lakes and rivers, and those are for sure if the Copepods are born in those places, they're for sure usher. What about in the aqueducts and the pipes and the water mains? That was the third and the fifth and the seventh. He said those are charitzim and itzim. Okay. So the charitzim itzim, the big flowing canals, like someone built a canal that exactly had that status. So some people wanted to say that. So that's how he said. Therefore, to think that the bugs should be. Okay, the first step of this whole argument was that the bugs are nearly nayim. But you want to say, okay, but they're nearly nayim, but they're born in a place where they wouldn't be aser. He says, no, they're not. They're born either in yam and chalam or charitzim itzim, and either one of those are reason to make the bugs aser. Now, there were people who said, no, the aqueducts and the pipes and the water mains are considered to be kalim, because think about it, what's an aqueduct or a pipe? A water main. A water main is a pipe that was stuck on the ground. So he says, first of all, is that kalim that are created, assuring l'shtamish makarka, that are built to be attached to the ground, do not have the status of kalim for all kinds of other halachas, including for this one. Second is that what the Gemara says that the difference between charitzin, between a canal and a bar, is in these halachas is whether the water flows or doesn't flow. Now, obviously, water flows through aqueducts and canals, aqueducts and water mains and things like that. Obviously, the water is flowing through them. So even if it doesn't make a difference whether it's technically a kli per se. The feature of the kli that we'd have to look for is in a kli the water just sits still, doesn't go anyplace, as opposed to in a canals the water flows, and of course here it's flowing through also. So for those two reasons together were a big part of being able to say that the water, the bugs and the copepods in the water would be usher, and a person would have to filter them out. Okay, now let's move on to some issues having to do with Pesach. Most people nowadays go to the rabbi and they tell him to sell all of their chametz to a guy for Erev Pesach. They get rid of a certain amount of their chametz, but the paper that they write to the rabbi doesn't say, I want to sell this box of cookies or this bottle of schnapps. It just says, I'm selling all the chametz that I have to the guy. I want you to sell it for me, all this chametz to the guy. So we have a problem. If that mechira happens, so let's say on Erev Pesach, the person goes to burn their chametz at 9 o'clock in the morning. If the mechira happens before that, okay, I'm sorry, one more step. When you burn the chametz, let's say at 9 o'clock, and at 9:15 you're finished, and you mevatel your chametz. So if the mechira happens before, let's say the mechira happened at 8 o'clock, then when the Jew goes ahead and burns the chametz, he's stealing from the guy because it was just sold at 8 o'clock, so he'd be stealing from it. So to avoid that problem, it's common that the rabbis do the mechiras chametz later in the morning. So they'll schedule the mechiras chametz for 10 or 11 o'clock, figuring by that time most people have already been mevatel the chametz. So the problem is that if I'm mevatel my chametz, then I made it. It's a form of making it hefker, in which case you can't sell it anymore. So how could then if at 9 o'clock I burnt the chametz, and at 9:15 I was mevatel any chametz that they didn't burn, then how can I do a mechira? So what's going on here? So either the mechira happens first, in which case you can't burn it, or the burning and bittul happens first, in which case you can't sell it. So which way? Which way is it? So there are different possibilities of how it could work. I'm going to mention 4 possibilities. Every one of these have poskim who disagree with them, but these are 4 possibilities. And the question was, what's the truth, or what's really going on? So one is when a yid sells his chametz to the guy, he's retracting his bittul. Okay, now that's not the word works so well over here because the yid doesn't actually sell the chametz to the guy. The first answer would be to say is, if I literally go over to my next door neighbor and I say to him, here, please buy this box of cookies, I'm undoing my bittul. That doesn't work so well over here. Second would be is, since he plans on selling the chametz, then as soon as he's mevatel it, he reacquires it because he wants to make mechira, which of course causes us problems because then basically he didn't do bittul. He owned the chametz and he was not mevatel. That's not too good either for Pesach. So the third possibility is maybe bittul doesn't work for things that you plan on selling. And the fourth is maybe the bittul that I make doesn't work instantly. It works later, at the end of the 5th hour when chametz becomes masar b'hana. Maybe that's when it comes into effect. In which case the mechira happened, slipped in before the bittul will happen afterwards. Okay, so Rav Feivel said like this. He said, first of all, he said is the Rabbanim where he lived in Flatbush at that time. That's where he lived most of his life. Say that any chametz that the yid plans on burning, that he has set aside for burning, is not included in the mechira. In other words, they tell us, the paper says that people are selling all their chametz. That's not really the truth. Really what they're doing is they're selling only the chametz, most of their chametz, but chametz that they plan to burn does not include in the mechira. And he said that the Chazon Ish says that everyone holds that there's such a thing as yesh b'reira when we make a mechira, and therefore I could even say what will be burnt isn't in the mechira, but they don't go exactly with that. So they say whichever things will be designated for me, not that I happen to burn. The things that I plan to burn does not include. Okay, so the person, so the chametz, the person put on the side is not included in the mechira, so he could burn it, and then he could burn what he can, and then he could do bittul afterwards. Okay, that helps for a lot of the problems. So the question is like this for now. What happens but if the person burns his chametz and he does bittul? So that what I mentioned until now, what Feivel had said will work if the mechira happens earlier in the day. But what happens if the mechira, like usual, happens after the bittul? So then the mechira has nothing to work on because the mechira has nothing to work on because the person did the bittul before the mechira happened. He sort of made it hefker. So Feivel said to that, he said is the bittul that the person does is saying is I am mevatel anything that the mechira doesn't help for. In other words, it's sort of like I have to do. Chacham said you have to get rid of your chametz and you have to be mevatel your chametz. But really, they're saying that in order to make sure that one of them at least will work, and that's basically what the person is saying is that I'm being mevatel anything that I haven't gotten rid of through mechira. Okay, so I want whatever's going to work. That's what I want to work, and somehow that works, even though the two things seem opposite of each other. But the point is, the person is saying is I'm covered, and that's what Chazal had in mind, that you should be covered, and therefore the person made sure they took care of that by doing the bittul and the mechira, even though in a certain sense they can't both work. Now, again, I'll mention all of this has to do with the way we do mechiras. It'd be very different if you actually just sold, a box of spaghetti to your next door neighbor, which how it was done, 100 years ago. Okay. Also, he mentioned in passing that the Star Mechiras says that they're selling all the chametz and even the safra chametz, which is to say that includes foods that no one really has any idea. Like you have a bottle of ketchup, you have no idea whether the vinegar in there is chametz or not chametz. No one can figure that out. So he says that's including the mechiras sort of automatically. Okay, let's go on to another thing. There was a question about taking medicine, which is chametz and Pesach. So here's the question. If a person is a choleh she'ein bo sakana, so he can't be over an isurim deraisa, but he can do isurim derabanan that will help him get better. So, for example, he could eat chametz shelo k'derech hana asan in an unusual, atypical way. He could eat chametz like that because that's only asur derabanan, and therefore, since he's a choleh she'ein bo sakana, he could eat chametz, and that might help him to eat. When we're talking about medicines that are liquid or chewable and they're considered somewhat edible, eating them, if you could eat them in a way that's shelo k'derech hana asan, which is not unreasonable. If he could do that, then he would avoid the problem of eating chametz on Pesach, because he's a choleh who's allowed to eat that kind of chametz, and he ate it. To eat a chametz in a way that's shelo k'derech hana asan, and therefore he can get away with it, and he'd solve that problem. The problem is that on Pesach there's an issur deraisa to own chametz. So it could be that when he eats the chametz shelo k'derech hana asan, he ate them in a way that's only asur d'rabanan, but the chametz is still edible, and if it's edible, then it's asur d'raisa. Forget about to eat it, because he's going to avoid the issur d'raisa of eating by eating a shelo k'derech hana asan. But there's an issur d'raisa to own the chametz. Chametz that's edible, you're not allowed to own. So how's he going to get? Is there a way to get around that problem? So the question was a possible solution of a way that he could, so to speak, get around that, and that is the Pri Megadim says like this: if a person, the Pri Megadim is talking about a choleh. He says there's a choleh who needs to use a cream on Pesach. So he says, so the rubbing of the cream he'll do in a way that's shelo k'derech hana asan, that's fine. He says what about owning it? He says, I'll tell you what. He says the din is, if you own chametz on Pesach, but you have in mind, and you actually carry through on it, you have in mind to get rid of it before the end of Pesach, the owning of that chametz is only issur d'rabanan that person owned that chametz on Pesach. To be over midiraisa, you have to either acquire it on Pesach, or you have to own it through the entire Pesach. But if you plan on getting rid of it while it's still Pesach, and you actually do carry through on that, you get rid of it, then you only over midrabanan. So the Pri Megadim says, so let him do that is by the end of the seventh day, meaning when the deraisa would finish, let him get rid of the chametz, then have that in mind and get rid of it. Use it until that day, then he gets rid of it. And then it'll have only been the Rabbanan, and since it's the Rabbanan, the choleh she'ein bo sakana is allowed to use it. So the question for Rav Feivel was, okay, so let's do the same thing. Forget about for a cream. Let's do it by eating it. And the question is based on the Baal HaMorah says that eating chametz is a form of beer. It's a form of hashpasa. You destroy the chametz when you eat it. So but if I say, let's say the person needs one pill every day. So what he could do is make sure he has only 7 pills. He'll eat 1 pill each day of each of the first 7 days of Pesach, which are the deraisa days of Pesach. By the 7th day, he will have destroyed all the chametz. Destroyed it not in a classic, I don't know, throw it into the ocean kind of destruction, but destruction by eating it. So that's his way of getting issur down to an issur d'rabanan. In which case, he as a choleh she'ein bo sakana is allowed to do that. And that was a question for Feivel: is that okay? And he said, no. Listen, he says there's so many Rishonim argue with the Baal HaMorah and hold that that's not considered a form of hashpasa, that you cannot rely on that. That's not an eitzah for a person to, as a way to get rid of their chametz, to say, I'm sorry, for a way for the choleh to eat chametz on Pesach shelo k'derech hana asan. Okay, one more Pesach question. I'm not going to go into all the details. So the question was complicated. And the question itself is not complicated. The details of how he got to the question and the answer are complicated. But the overall question was, we have vinegar, which is, and similar things like that. And you don't know whether it's chametz or kidneys. In the United States, most of them are made from kidneys. Most of those types of things, let's say vinegar almost is usually made from corn. It can be chametz liquid. So the question is is a person allowed to own something like that on Pesach when there's a roiv that says that it's kidneys, but the possibility that it's chametz has to do with questions about yavish. So the question itself was quite complicated. I'm just going to mention the conclusion, which was the vast majority of these things, the glucose and the starch and the enzymes are made from kidneys. The person is allowed to keep them on vinegar, and when they're of unknown origin, you don't know if it's chametz or kidneys, then you're allowed to keep it, assuming that thing is kidneys. Okay, now let's move on to some Kashering questions. Two Kashering issues. The first is about spray dryers. So a long time ago, the date I'm talking about here is in the 1990s, the end of 1990, and the question was how to kasher spray dryers. Spray dryers, I'll say quickly, it's this big machine, and it's basically a big empty chamber, and it's there's a fire burning that makes it very hot. The inside of the air is very hot in it, and you spray water in a very fine mist, and what happens is the water is so in such tiny droplets, and the air is so hot that the water boils out. So let's say you spray in coffee into there, so all the water boils out of what was the coffee, leaving behind just the powder, and that's what we call instant coffee. So the question is, how do you kasher the spray dryer, and do you need to do hagolah, which is possible, not easy, but it's possible to do hagolah, or does it need libun because it's basically there's no liquid, but whatever hits the walls of this device are solids, because by the time it hits the walls, it's a powder. So the question is, does this need libun or hagolah? It's a very big question going on at that time in 1990 and that around that times about what was the correct way to kasher them, and a lot of the discussion revolved around an article that Rabbi Yaakov Lubin from the OU wrote about that shaila at that time. He wrote the shaila, with lots of detail. Wrote out the shaila and his thoughts on it in lots of detail. And he spoke to lots of people about that. So I didn't speak to Rav Feivel about that question myself, but I have Rabbi Lubin wrote notes on the side of his article. The notes are dated December 31st, 1990. And he says like this, I'll read the words that he wrote. He said, basically agrees that it's called al ha'esh, and kabbalah kachpolta is a weak heter. However, since it's only mechur, maybe you could play with kabbalah kachpolta and besamach on hakoyas marmini, but very weak. Let me explain what he was trying to say, or what he appears to be saying. Is one question here is this considered to be it's al ha'esh or not al ha'esh? Is this cooking on the fire? If it's cooking on the fire, that's what you need. That's when you need libun. If it's off the fire, then it only needs hagolah. If a dry piece of food falls on something off the fire, it only needs hagolah. If it's on the fire and there's no liquids, then it needs libun. So he's saying, Rav Feivel said basically it seems like it's al ha'esh. The reason why it should possibly not be al ha'esh is because there's no fire in the spray dryer, or even on the very outside of the spray dryer. It's a little distance away, and the heat gets blown in from the fire. So Rav Feivel is saying is no, basically that's considered al ha'esh. So what about the fact that maybe we should kasher it the way we use it, kabbalah kachpolta? Maybe that should be okay. It came kasher al ha'esh like this. Maybe you can get away with a weaker libun. He goes, nah, he didn't think that kabbalah kachpolta could work on it. He says, but then at the end he says maybe it could be some that lower temperatures are considered to be libun. That's considered libun kal. Maybe that's considered libun. Maybe he says, and over here he says since it's only mechur, which is to say is, and that's like a code word over here, which is to say is that Rav Moshe has a tshuva where he says that when you use a kli that's eina ben yomai, the food that's made on that kli is 100% kosher even lechatchila. The only isser there is for the person who produced the food on that kli. That person, he did an isser by producing it on the kli. So he says that isser d'Rabbanan of using a kli that's eina ben yomai only applies to Yidden. A company that's owned by not Jewish people, they don't have that isser. So for them, but it's mechur, it's disgusting. We might say nicely, we might say inappropriate that we should give hashgacha on a company doing something that we ourselves would not be allowed to do. We wouldn't be allowed to use a kli that's ene ben yomer to make kosher food if we didn't kasher that kli first. The guy doesn't have that problem. So for us to give a hashgacha on it, that's what mechor. So what Rav Feivel was saying is, since it's only an issue of mechor, but already the kli is going to be ene ben yomer anyhow. So maybe you could say, in that case, it could be bal kachpotai, samachan agres maimoni. But again, he ends up it's very weak, and he obviously was not very happy about using that kind of kasher. Okay, and the other kasher related question is regards to kashering plastic, and that is there are Ramosha held. Well, before we get to Ramesh himself, is that the Torah says you can kasher metal, and the Gemara says that means also wood and stone can be a kasher, and the Torah says you can't use hagala on cheres. So the question is, there are many different materials, and the place can talk about different materials. Basically, there's all these ones that you can kasher, and there's cheres and certain related ones, maybe glasses like cheres, and certain ones like that we cannot do hagala to. So the question came up: okay, what's with plastic? It's a new material. Is that like cheres that you can't kasher it, or it's like metal that you can kasher? You can do hagala to it. So Ramosha was of the opinion that it's like we can only kasher the materials that we have precedent that we're allowed to kasher them. Any new material that comes up, we're stuck and we can't kasher it. So he said you should not kasher plastic. And Rav Feivel and other places in Eretz Yisrael took the opposite approach. They said look, the Torah said don't kasher cheres because it absorbs so much. If we have another material that doesn't have that property, then we can kasher just like metal. Okay, and they would allow kashering of plastic. So I asked him, what does he think about that? So he said, listen, if there was a shas chag, he would tell somebody that they could kasher plastic, but in general, he wasn't so sure which way to say, whether he should or shouldn't do it. And he thought that it was like a question. He wasn't ready to give a specific answer on whether you should kasher. And he said, listen, if it's a real shas chag, an example that he sort of gave of that was like a person moves into a house and now they're going to do a one-time kashering to move over from treif to kosher. So he thought that was a b'diavad for tell a person they have to cover their counter or their tables forever. But so for shas chag, he said, yeah, and then he'd be masking that a person could kasher plastic, like what I was describing of Formica. But otherwise, didn't want to give a clear answer on that thing. Okay, now let's do two more shilos. One of them has to do with tevilah's kelim, and that is I'm going to give some background on the question. That there's a whole many people talk about whether a person is required to tevel electrical appliances like a Keurig machine. The CRC's position happens to be you don't have to, but what about for the people who think that you do? They say just because it's electrical, it doesn't make a difference. You have to tevel it if you want to use it. So the thing is that people are afraid to tevel because they're afraid it's not going to work afterwards. Okay, so they're trying to avoid teveling it, but there are those who hold that you in fact have to tevel them anyhow. So somebody in Lakewood came up with this interesting idea, and he said like this. He said the Chacham says that if you have a kli that a guy made, and it basically needs tefillah's kelim before you use it, but it got broken to the point that you can't use it anymore. And then a yid came along and fixed it. A yid came along and made it usable. Then it's as if the yid created that kli from scratch, and you don't have to tevel it because a yid made it. If a yid made it, you don't have to tevel it. Okay. Now in that discussion, this Chacham Sodom, it's understood that it doesn't just mean is like, let's say you have something and you make it, you just take the cover off, you take it apart in an easy way to fix it. That doesn't count. When we say it's broken, it has to have been so broken that it would take an uman, somebody with a skill, who knows what he's doing in order to fix it. But if you just break something simple, like imagine you pull a plug out of the wall, so you say, "Oh, it's broken, it doesn't work now." That's silly because if a yid just plugs it back in, that doesn't count. The yid didn't do anything. It had to be that it was truly broken. It was like not functional, and it would take an uman to fix it. If it takes an uman to fix it, then if that uman who does the fixing is a yid, then that's considered a yid making, and no tevilah's kelim. You don't need to tevel. Okay, so what happens? This person in Lakewood did is like this. He learned how to open up a Keurig machine, and he played around with the internal workings of the machine, and he figured out how to break it in a way that would take an uman to fix it, and And then he did it like this. You bring in your machine. He brought in the machine. And a Keurig has to boil up water. And it has to pump water. So if the electrical connections are not working inside, the whole machine is worthless. It doesn't work at all. So what he did was, there were wires that helped it function that were welded together, soldered together. And what he did was like this: he would unsolder that connection, so to break now the wire. Now the machine doesn't work, and then he would solder it right back on. So he would unsolder it, then he would resolder it. The whole thing took him a few minutes. The whole thing to do. He was very familiar with the machines. He unsoldered it, soldered it back together. He says, "Good. Now it was made by Yid. Now it doesn't need to be tevillah. Now it's perfect, like the Choftzim says." So he showed this machine his procedure to Shmuel Meir Katz. He's a Pesach in Lakewood, and he was good. He was happy with it. He said, "Look, when the pumping and electrical parts don't work, the things that hold water in the Keurig, then they're so non-kalim that they don't even that pump on the inside couldn't even stand on its own legs. Okay, it doesn't even. It has these like legs coming out of it. If you start on the table, it would fall right over. So it was like literally worthless. It's not a clear at all. It has no function at all. And therefore, when you solder it and make it now function as a Keurig machine, then that's what you made into a clear." Rav Feivel also agreed with this idea. He had it from a different angle, why it's worthless. He said is, if you don't have a pump in here, and you wanted to say that canister on the inside of the Keurig functions as a cup, he said, okay, it could be a cup, but it's not a cup that you could use for making coffee. It doesn't work. It's not, the electrical parts don't work. It doesn't work. He says, it's like, imagine if a person has a cup that they use for watering flowers. Okay, that's how they do this cup. You don't have to title that because it's not used for food. He says over here also, the canister that's in the Keurig machine, it has no food use. It can't do anything for food because you can't cook water up in it. So maybe you can put water into it, but it has no functional use. And therefore he says, okay, so we're good. You can, by making it not work as a pot that can cook up water, you've now made it broken the machine in a way that only an uman can fix it. And when the uman, a yid, fixes it, now it doesn't need tevillah. Okay, well, that was so far so good. What happened was, it turns out that when the person takes out, breaks the soldering, however you do that, and he gets ready to put it back in, what's left behind is that the wire fits, the place where the wire needs to be reattached is not just soldered together. There's actually a metal loop, like a ring, and the wire fits right into that. When you put the wire in, now it's sitting in the right place. Now you solder it to make it stay in place. So that means to say is that the soldering is what holds it in place. But the connection is there perfectly fine, even if you don't solder it into place. Just the metal wire sitting through the loop, through the little hole that's there, what makes it work. So the soldering doesn't make it function. The soldering is what makes it stay put. So actually, what's going on here is that it takes an uman to break the kli. It takes an uman to take off the soldering, because me and you, most people can't, unsolder something by themselves. No problem. Most people can't even solder it back on by themselves. True, an uman needs to do both of those jobs. But the breaking took an uman, and the making it permanent takes an uman. But the in between, to make it functional, didn't take an uman. Anybody could just stick the wire back into the hole. So the question now for Feivel now was well, an uman broke it. That doesn't mean anything. What does it take to fix it? It doesn't take an uman to fix it. Seemingly, you could just stick the wire into the hole, and that makes it work again. So here's Rav Feivel what he thought about that, and he said if by sticking the wire into the hole, you could make, he says, 10 cups of coffee, and it'll work without soldering. In other words, it's reasonably functional. It may not be permanent. Eventually, the wire is going to get jiggled out of the hole. But if it could reasonably function to make, and he said 10 cups of coffee, then that's considered that it's doing, in his words, me'ein malachta rishona. This is like a tuma or a muktzah type of language. It's still basically functioning the way it was supposed to be, and therefore the fixing did not take an uman, and therefore this eitzah is not going to work. So we tried it. We unsoldered it, and we just stuck the wire back into the hole, and it made way more than 10 cups of coffee. It just kept on going. We just stuck it in. Put a little post-it note on top of it to hold it in place a little bit, but that wasn't an uman to put a post-it note on it, and it kept on going. So it would appear that, according to the way Rav Feivel told us how to look at it, that would not be considered a good eitzah for how to make the kli not need tevillah. Just as a postscript to that is that when someone else, another person thought about the shaila, he says, even putting the wire back into the hole takes an uman, because people who know where to put the wire in. Even that idea of putting it into the hole itself was an uman. And others didn't agree with that. They said, "What? If you see a wire dangling and you see a hole where it fits into, it seems pretty obvious that's where the wire belongs, in that hole. It's not working because there's a wire dangling there and there's a hole right where it fits into. So that's a question of how knowledgeable you think people are, whether that's considered an uman or not." Okay, that's like a postscript. Okay, and our last thing is, there's nothing that this is secondhand or maybe even third hand over here, and that is, there's questions about whether a mumar, a person who's a mumar, creates Stam yayin. If he touches wine, does that wine become usher as Stam yayin? So there's discussion about that, and in fact, yes, it would. The question is like this: if that's true, now we go a step further. The question that I'm probably going to talk about is what happens if a mumar cooks food. The reason why if the mumar touches the wine, it's because mumar is dina ka'akum. So what happens if the mumar bakes food or he cooks food? Is that bishul akum and pas akum? And if it is, does that mean is the mumar, the din would say is he's not allowed to eat the food he cooks himself? Seems a little odd. I mean, maybe that's true, because if his food is bishul akum, well, you're not allowed to eat bishul akum. So it's bishul, his own bishul, but he might not be allowed to do that. Rabbi Rees brought from Rav Moshe says no, even though we're machmir that the wine touched by a mumar is asur, even so he could drink his own wine. Okay, he could drink his own wine. Rabbi Friedman told me that Rav Feivel said that no, you should not give non-voshel wine to a mumar, because if you do, you'd be machshel him that he's going to drink Stam yayin. When you give him wine that's not mavoshel, when he touches the wine or he pours the wine, that will make it Stam yayin, and then he won't be allowed to drink it. So if you give him wine that's not mavushal, you'll be machshel him that tomorrow he's going to drink that wine. Okay. Anyhow, Rav Moshe maybe is connected to the fact that maybe he thought that people weren't such mumrim, maybe has different dinim. That might be related to that. Those are sort of not for today's question, but Rav Feivel's, at least it was quoted to me. This is secondhand. Hearing that he said that maybe that he said you should not give non-mavoshel wine to the mumar, because then you'd be machshel him because he's not allowed to drink it, and therefore you'd be machshel him to do it nisr. Okay, it should be a schuz and a neshama.